in 1st and 2nd Kings, well, 2nd Kings. And today I get to talk about, I have the privilege to talk about, well, I picked the story of Elisha taking up Elijah's mantle, or it's probably more well known as the story of Elijah being taken up into the whirlwind. Speaking of which, I am going to screw up and call Elijah Elisha, or Elijah Elijah at some point in this message. And so I ask you kindly to just assume whichever one would sound the most right in the moment. That's what the name that I was going for at the time. So I wanted to start out saying, when I was in school, I was a part of sort of the collection of majors collectively known as the ministry majors, because most of them just had the word ministry in their title. There was obviously, I was a theology major, which doesn't have the word ministry in it, but then there was pastoral ministry, there was youth ministry, cross-cultural ministries, and worship ministries. So there was the 5 of us. And we were collectively known as the ministry majors. And something fascinating that I learned in being around these ministry majors while I was there, is every single one of them, at least that I got to speak to, had a story, something they could point back to, a person, a mentor that they had, particularly through their college, high school and college years, that is the reason, or at least an important part of the reason they were there at Barclay, at the school in the first place. And I thought this was fascinating. I don't say this to say that, ministry majors are somehow some particularly important class of Christians or paragons of Christianity in any particular way. But just to say that, if nothing else, these are people who were willing to dedicate 4 years of their life and several $1,000s worth of money to spend their time learning how to do ministry and learning about their faith. So the thing that I took away from that is there's something, I think, essentially important about having a mentor through those years, through those especially high school and into college years, this transition into adulthood, if you will. And I found studies that back this up. There's been plenty of studies into why do certain people go on to have faith in adulthood and others not. And the very most important factor, one that I think is probably not all that surprising, is whether or not the faith is talked about and practiced at home. If you talk with your children about your faith, or if your children that talk to your parents about the faith, that is the single greatest indicator that they will go on to have a faith into their adulthood. The second is having a non-parental mentor figure during the high school years. Transitioning, so like a youth group or something like that, transitioning into adulthood by having a non-family member as a mentor. In fact, actually, a number that's thrown around in youth ministry often is you want to shoot for 5 to 1. You want to have 5 adult mentors for every 1 child. That's sort of the ideal number. Probably an impossible ideal, but ideal. So the 2 most important things you possibly for indicating whether or not you will have a faith into adulthood is having a family that talks about and practices your faith at home, and having a mentor during your transition into adulthood. And the reason that I think this is for one, it gives you a chance to hear what your parents say mirrored back to you through someone else, because I'm sure all of us, I think most of us have been high schoolers, and the last thing we want to do is listen to our parents. But when someone comes along and says something your parents have been saying for your entire life, you go, "Wow, that's genius! What a lovely idea!" So you can really take it to heart. Similarly, they think that it provides a safe space to ask questions and raise doubts without the fear of your parents, freaking out. "Oh no, my child is losing their faith." So it gives them a chance to, go to this mentor figure, someone who's a little bit more removed from the family's faith, and say, "Hey, this doesn't make sense to me," and ask questions and raise doubts. And those things are, I think, essential for a child to have a strong faith into adulthood. The reason that I bring this up is because I think that least for our purposes. Oh, I think I jumped. Oh, I'm not connected. That's why. Here, give me one sec. The reason that I think this is important is I think that this is a lot of what we can get out of this story for ourselves. The story of Elijah and Elisha, this transition of leadership, I think is fundamentally telling us something about mentorship. At least that's something that I think we can take away from it. So I've titled this message, Taking Up the Mantle, for that reason. I think this story is about Elisha following and pursuing Elijah into this new role to transition into taking Elijah's position. Well, I'll actually talk about the thing now. This is my favorite part of every message I get to preach. I get to give some context. It's absolutely my favorite part. The Book of Kings, a handful of things to know about the Book of Kings. Importantly, I think fundamentally, it is about answering the question, how did we get here? Why are we in exile when God has made all of these promises to us? What happened that got us into exile? We think, at least the best guess that scholars have, is that the book was at least compiled, finished in exile, in the Babylonian exile, after the kingdom of Judah is taken away to Babylon. It was likely started earlier, probably during the time of King Josiah, who's one of the last kings in the book, last kings of Judah. He's held up as a paragon of what a king should be before everything starts going back downhill. So likely, Josiah in the story institutes a bunch of religious reforms, and they seem to be essentially the criteria by which the writer judges the rest of the kings of the book. So we think that it was started during the time of King Josiah, to say, hey, we're heading towards exile, and we need to turn this ship around so that we don't end up exiled like the northern kingdom of Israel. And then in exile, the book sort of gets recompiled or put together and added the information since the book had been written up to that point, a handful of generations, or a handful of years. I don't remember the exact number of years off the top of my head. And so the book eventually becomes, rather than, hey, turn around, we're heading to exile, is, well, we blew it. How did we get here? What happened? And what do we do now? What does it look like now that we're in exile? So I think that's the thing to know about the Book of Kings. Well, the First and Second Kings, they're collectively one piece. And along with that, I want to make the point that they are first and foremost theological literature. They are written for the purpose of telling you something about God. They are not mere history. We know this because they make use of history textbooks. They quote other history books all throughout both Kings and Chronicles. They say, oh, yeah, if you want to actually know the rest of what that guy did, there's this history book you can go look at that has all this history about the kings and stuff. That's not what this book is about, apparently. It's not about the history of those kings. It has important events in the lives of all of these kings, but the purpose is pointing you to a theological message. How do we get here? What is a good king, and why have our kings failed, and what can we do now? So it is theological literature first. Not to say that it isn't history. It's just not comprehensive. That's just not the goal. It's first and foremost there to tell you something about God. In fact, and I think we do this all over the place. I'm sorry, I digressed a good deal, but it's retelling the story of Israel to make a theological point, to ask the question, who is God in all of this? And I think probably most of us can relate to that. There's many times throughout our lives that we sort of retell our story to ourselves to understand who God is to us in the moment. Maybe we retell the stories and remember all the times that God seemed to have failed. Or maybe we retell the story and remember all the times that God took care of us. And that is how we understand who he is. Anyway, I think that's the point of the book. With that, Elijah and Elisha also bear some comment. They're both prophets to the northern kingdom of Israel. They split after the line of Solomon into the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. The southern kingdom lasts longer and is taken out by Babylon, and Israel is taken out first, about 200 years before. It's taken out by Assyria and taken into exile. Excuse me. And in fact, the northern kingdom doesn't ever return, unlike the southern kingdom. So they are prophets to this kingdom that we know, well, and the writers of the book know by this point, is in exile, has been taken out. And at various points in the writing, essentially, they become a critique. Say, hey, this is what happened to the northern kingdom, and we don't want to be like, we want to survive. We don't want to get taken to exile, so let's not act like them. And Elijah and Elisha are sort of the paragons of this, the picture of the power of the prophetic voice that was given to Israel, saying, hey, Israel got these two amazing prophets, and they still failed. Like, are we going to do something different? Are we going to listen to the prophets that we have now that are telling us not to go into exile, or the prophets that we have that are telling us that we're going to get out of exile? Right? They are a critique of the southern kingdom by way of the northern kingdom. So their mission collectively was to call out the northern kingdom, was to save it from exile. And though ultimately their mission itself was a failure, their legacy is enduring to this day. They're two of probably the most popular prophetic figures in the Old Testament. And they become a sort of Moses and Joshua duo. They show this picture, this pattern of the generations passing on the torch of faith from the Elijah, the Moses figure, to Elisha, the Joshua figure. And because of this, they become a really important part, and because of this story, become a very important part of messianic expectation later in the biblical story. In fact, and I will not take long on this either, but just to raise this thought, in every one of the Gospels, the John the Baptist is linked with Elijah in some way. Everyone wants to know, hey, is this Elijah? Has Elijah come back? Is that who this is? Or is Jesus Elijah? But all four of the Gospels link John the Baptist with Elijah. And I think that feels important. And if he's an Elisha or an Elijah, then I think Jesus is an Elisha figure. So I think there's probably something to be said for comparing the life and the story, the ministry of Elisha and Jesus. But I won't talk about that. Okay, I want to read the whole passage to you first. It's not too terribly long. We're in 2 Kings 2, we'll read 1 through 14, I believe. It's not too terribly long, so hopefully we can follow along. And I'll have them on the screen as well. Actually, I don't know if I'm reading. Well, I'll keep it up here, but I'll read it from the screen. The time had come for the Lord to take Elijah up to heaven in a whirlwind. Elijah and Elisha were traveling from Gilgal, and Elijah said to Elisha, "Stay here. The Lord is sending me on to Bethel." But Elisha replied, "As the Lord lives, and as you yourself live, I will not leave you." So they went down to Bethel. So they are, the passage begins, it's, that time for Elijah to be taken up into the whirlwind, that time that happens to all of us. And Elijah and Elisha were in Gilgal, and they were heading out to Bethel. That's where Elijah was being taken. Interestingly, and I won't take too terribly much time, but I think is relevant to the themes. Gilgal is the first place that the Israelites camped after Joshua had crossed the Jordan. They crossed the Jordan River and they camp in Gilgal, preparing to siege the city of Jericho. That's where they stay. And I do think that's genuinely relevant, though it's a neat piece of trivia anyway. Actually, reading the Bible and holding a map in your hand will help a lot, I think, actually. Understand what's happening. But regardless, they're about to take this big, long journey. And so Elijah says to Elisha, "Hey, stay here. I'm going to go travel to Bethel, and you hang out here." And Elijah's absolutely not down. He says, as the Lord lives and as you live, I will not leave you. I think this is effectively a vow. As long as the Lord lives, I will not leave you. So they head to Bethel. Bethel is another fascinating little place. After Jericho is destroyed, the very next battle that happens is a battle that takes place in between Bethel to the east and Ai to the west, in this valley in between these two cities. Ai spelled A-A-I. Fascinatingly, this battle goes horribly wrong at first because someone had taken things from Jericho and they have to sort of fight it all again, and Joshua comes up with a neat plan to lure everybody out of the city and then wrap back around and burn Ai to the ground. So Ai doesn't get rebuilt. Bethel goes on to be conquered a little bit later. But interestingly, again, they camp at Gilgal, they destroy Jericho, and then they go here to fight this battle in this valley. between Bethel and Ai. I don't know if it's as relevant, but I think it's also interesting to note this is the first place that Abraham lived as well when he was still called Abram and called to the land of Canaan. The very first place that he goes to live in the valley with Bethel to the east and Ai to the west. I don't know if that's as relevant, but I think it's neat. Anyway, so Bethel is an interesting place, particularly in the book of Kings. It was the Bethel that Jacob named after he had his famous vision of Jacob's ladder. He slept there with his head on a rock, and he wakes up and he names the place Bethel, which is house of God. That's what the word means. He later goes on to rename it El Bethel, which is neat, which means God's house of God, which I think is wild, fantastic name. But Bethel, is an important place in Jewish history. But when the northern kingdom splits from the southern kingdom and the northern kingdom begins to worship other gods, eventually, a particularly bad king in northern Israel's history takes and creates two golden calves and sends one down to the territory of Dan, and the other one is in Bethel. This idol of a golden calf is sent to Bethel. So this is an important place in the northern kingdom also, which is why I think there is, Elijah had set up this group called the Sons of the Prophets. There are a number of places, but one of them that is indicated that there was this group of prophets called the Sons of the Prophets was at Bethel. So when it says, the sons of the prophets who were at Bethel came out to Elijah and said, "Do you know that the Lord will take your master from you today?" He said, "Yes, I know. Be quiet." So for some reason, and the text doesn't tell us, but I would assume, they're both prophets, I assume for some prophetic reason they know that Elijah is going to be taken today. And by the way, this all happens in one single day. The whole story happens in one big day. It's actually a long walk. So we don't know exactly why, but we can assume somehow through probably prophetic means, both the sons of the prophets and more sons of the prophets as we see later on, and Elisha himself understands that this is Elijah's last day, and Elisha is not willing to let him go. I was going to mention briefly, again, this being all happening in one single day, it's probably like 30 to like 36 miles of walking that happened in the day. It's kind of, though not exactly, it would be roughly if you walked from here to Green River and then back and then to like Reliance, that sort of like walk all in a single day. So this is a pretty significant little trek that they're taking, and I think that's significant also. Right? Elijah is going to give Elisha an out every time. Did I say I was going to read the passage and then I didn't do that? Oh my! Wow, that's all right. We'll save time. That's okay. So Elijah is going to give Elisha an out every time they reach a new city. He's going to say, "Oh, you stay here. You don't have to continue on this long journey with me." And Elisha is going to repeat his vow. "No, I'm going to follow you no matter what." And so they take this grueling. It's probably a 14-hour day that they walk from Gilgal to Bethel back to the Jericho and then to the Jordan. And Elisha is pursuing Elijah at every step. And in fact, they're spending a considerable amount of time together, probably something that they've done a lot, walking from town to town. But I think that is relevant already to the theme of mentorship. I think that the sort of Christianese phrase for it is that they're doing life together, right? Like spending hours on the road walking and talking. Actually, it'll mention that later. I think is an important place where mentorship happens, like when we're just next to each other, doing normal things together, I think is an important place where mentorship takes place. Regardless, moving forward. Elijah, again giving him an out, says, "Elisha, stay here, the Lord is sending me to Jericho." But Elisha says, "As the Lord lives and as you yourself live, I will not leave you." So they went to Jericho. Of course, Jericho being the first place that Joshua's conquest destroyed. So then the sons of the prophets who were in Jericho, again this group, the sons of the prophets that Elijah had established, when he takes a trip to Mount Carmel after his sort of showdown with Jezebel, he runs and he's lamenting before the Lord, "Hey, I'm alone, I'm the only one calling out Israel." And God says, no, I've saved 300 prophets for you that you don't know about. So he goes and finds these prophets and sets up this sort of prophetic network, this school of prophets that he calls the sons of the prophets. So there's one in Bethel, and there's obviously another group in Jericho. So the sons of the prophets who were in Jericho come up to Elisha and say, "Did you know the Lord will take your master away from you today?" And he says, "Yes, I know. Be quiet." So that's the third city that they went to. And interestingly, again, that Gilgal is right by the Jordan, and then they go east to Bethel, and then they come back to to Jericho, which is actually significantly closer to Gilgal than either of the two of them are to each other. So they make this big loop, and then they come back to basically right where they started. So finally, they get to Jericho, and Elijah said to him, "Stay here. The Lord is sending me on to the Jordan." But Elisha said, "As the Lord lives and as you yourself live, I will not leave you." So the two of them went on. 50 men from the sons of the prophets came and stood observing them at a distance, while the two of them stood by the Jordan. Elijah took his mantle, rolled it up, and struck the water, which parted to the right and left. Then the two of them crossed over on dry ground. And when they crossed over, Elijah said to Elisha, "Tell me what I can do for you before I am taken from you." So Elijah strikes the water, and they cross through the Jordan on dry ground. And if you're thinking, "Hey, that sounds familiar," that's exactly what Joshua did, but in reverse. They crossed the Jordan River, and crossed into Jericho. They camped at Gilgal. They destroyed Jericho, and they went on to Bethel. I think this is a fascinating thing that I think the author is doing on purpose. It's wanting you to see something in what they're doing is mirrored in what Joshua was doing. I think conquest. They're redoing this conquest narrative. Israel has fallen into apostasy, and they're coming back to renew Israel as it is. And eventually Elijah will cross back over the Jordan to again the mission that Elijah had to the northern kingdom of Israel. Again, a new Joshua come to take back the land again. And interestingly, the little section in there, Elijah took his mantle, rolled it up, struck the water, which parted to the right and left, and the two of them crossed on dry ground. So there are two other times where this sort of thing happens. Obviously, one is in the story of Moses. Moses, takes his staff and stretches it out, and the sea parts, and they cross the Reed Sea over into the Sinai Peninsula. And the second time is Joshua, to sort of show that he has the authority of Moses. He comes, and the Lord stops up the Jordan, and they cross over on dry ground. And interestingly, this is just sort of a hodgepodge of the language that both of those stories use. No one story contains all of these phrases, but together they all of them. So the author is picking pieces out of two of these stories to build together the description of this event, to make you think, oh, hey, like that thing that happened to Moses, and then again to Joshua. This transition of power thing. Again, I think very relevant to the theme of mentorship. This picture of passing on, like we'll see, passing on your spirit, or passing down the torch, taking up the mantle. And when they crossed over, Elijah said to Elisha, "Tell me what I can do for you before I am taken from you." This is, I think, where the story gets really, really good. So he asks, essentially, what can I do for you? You followed me all of this way. I kept, sort of letting you stop at any point. I could have, you could have given up. I think the idea is you could have chosen not to be my successor. I chose you as my successor every stop on the way. I said, "Are you sure? Are you sure this is what you want to do? Are you sure you want to step into my footsteps?" We've seen Elijah face some, significant opposition by kings and queens of Israel up until this point. This is a real and dangerous job that he's taking on. And Elijah's giving him an out over and over again. But finally, they get to the other side of the Jordan. He says, what can I do for you? And I think that is, what can I do for you before I go, I think is quintessentially the question of a good mentor. Right? It is what can I pass on to you before I am out of here? Either by passing literally or just moving on. In fact, I think Steve, Michael, and I, we talk frequently about how living in Rock Springs is transient. People come and go, stay for a few years, and then have to leave for work. There's a number of people that stay here all of their lives, but there's plenty of people that come and rotate out. And so we talk frequently about what do we have that we can give them while they're here? What do we have that's valuable enough to pass on to them before they're gone, before we're no longer an influence to them? I think that is the quintessentially a question of a mentor. What can I pass on to you that I have have learned. And I think Elijah's answer to that is brilliant, a perfect other side of that coin. So Elisha answered, "Please, let me inherit 2 shares of your spirit." I think in effect, he's saying, I want to be like you and more. I want to do the things you did. I want to be a person like you and even more. Again, I think that is the question of a mentee. I think if we're really, if a mentee is doing their job, if they're actually wanting to learn from a person, that is this question, is fundamentally, I want to be like you. I mean, that's the reason we have heroes, is we put people up on a pedestal to say, I want to be like those people. I think probably every parent would say in response that, I want you to be better than me. But I think this is like a perfect description of that relationship, of the mentor-mentee relationship, is I want to give something to you before I am gone, and I want to be like you and continue in your footsteps, growing and continue walking the path that you walked before me. And Elijah replies, and I think this is interesting, "You have asked for something difficult. If you see me being taken from you, you will have it. If not, you won't." I think that is, I'm not sure, I think that it is a description of sort of what has been happening this whole time. Right? You have the option to be my successor. I'm leaving that open for you. If you follow me to the end, that's what you will be. You will be my successor. If not, you won't. If you turn back now, well, then I won't have a successor. You won't be my successor. I think that's the idea. And if you want to inherit a double portion of my spirit, we're going to take this long walk. We're going to go on this journey together. So, after that, they walk a little bit further. It says, as they continued walking and talking, a chariot of fire with horses of fire suddenly appeared and separated the 2 of them. Then Elijah went up into heaven in a whirlwind. And as Elijah watched, he kept crying out, my father, the chariots and horsemen of Israel." And when he could see him no longer, he took hold of his own clothes and tore them in 2. No, as a sign of mourning. I'll be brief, but I think this is interesting. We have this picture that Elijah was picked up in a literal chariot, right? Like an actual, chariot of fire. There's obviously a chariot of fire in the story. I don't think that the chariot of fire is actually taking him away. I think that if that's what was happening, it would have just said that. It would have said Elijah hopped into the chariot of fire and then he took off into the sky. The term whirlwind is used, as far as I can tell, exclusively for storms. And like a cyclone, like literally a whirling wind. So I think Elijah was taken up in a storm, and the chariot of fire was made to separate them. Interestingly, I think part of the reason why we get this a little confused is Elisha, is out, my father, the chariots and horsemen of Israel. But I think that this is actually an epithet for Elijah. He's calling Elijah, my father, the chariots and horsemen of Israel. He's calling him the chariots and horsemen of Israel. That is, in effect, he is the champion of Israel. He's fighting on behalf of Israel to save the northern kingdom from this apostasy. That sounds odd, but it shows up again for Elijah. The exact same thing, Elisha. The exact same thing happens to Elisha later in the narrative. We have Elisha, he gets sick with the disease that is going to kill him, and the story pauses and says this. When Elisha became sick, this is 2 Kings 13:14. When Elisha became sick with the illness from which he died, King Jehoash of Israel went down and wept over him and said, my father, the chariots and horsemen of Israel. So I think this is a title for Elijah. In this moment, Elisha is seeing him as his father figure, and in fact, as the champion of Israel, a position that he himself is going to step in after he leaves. And so when Elisha disappears, Elisha goes into mourning, tearing his clothes and mourning the loss of this father figure. And then, he's gone. And Elisha is going to ask the question, did it work? Did I get this spirit, this double portion of his spirit? Says Elisha, goodness, Elisha picked up the mantle that had fallen off Elijah and went back and stood on the bank of the Jordan. He took the mantle Elijah had dropped, and he had struck the water, saying, "Where is the Lord God of Elijah?" he asked. He struck the water himself, and it parted to the right and the left, and Elisha crossed over. The exact same way that it parted for Elijah, it parts for Elisha. He enters back. He goes and meets with the sons of the prophets in the next section and is received as Elijah's successor. Essentially, his question is rhetorical. Have I received the spirit of Elijah? Where is the God of Elijah? And God's answer is, in effect, parting the river and saying, yes, absolutely, you have received the double portion of Elijah's spirit. And interestingly, Elijah, in 1 Kings, Elijah does 7 major miracles. And immediately after this story, Elisha gets 14. He's given 14 miracles back to back to back to back. In fact, the author sort of pulls them all out of chronological order to stack them right next to each other so that you can see in the story, yes, he literally inherited a double portion of Elijah's spirit. And in fact, he performs more miracles than any other Old Testament figure. No, not even Moses does as many miracles as Elisha does in the course of his ministry. And interestingly, one last little point, this whole thing, this whole moment of Elijah being taken up into the whirlwind happens to happen just by happenstance in the exact place where Moses died at the end of Deuteronomy, looking over the Jordan River towards Jericho, where Joshua is going to follow him as his successor. He sits there and he looks one last time at the promised land. He doesn't get to enter, and then he dies. And Joshua crosses the Jordan into the promised land and begins the conquest. I think that's lovely, isn't it? It's fascinating. But I think the whole story is trying to set up this parallel, trying to get you to see this transition is fundamental. I think this pattern, this sort of ritual, if you will, of passing the torch looks like this. This is what it looks like. It looks like a mentor pursuing, or a mentee pursuing their mentor. It looks like them living and doing life together. It looks like passing on more of yourself even than you had in life. So I want to talk briefly about what that looks like. So first, passing the torch. Elijah had been through a good deal before he saw Elisha. He went to Mount Carmel. He thought that he was alone, and he was given a cohort of prophets and a successor. And he had to trust by the time he got to the end of the Jordan that the mission that God had sent him on to save the kingdom of Israel was bigger than him alone, that he could trust that Elisha was going to carry the mission faithfully. And the church, I think, lives on that. I think that's how the church continues in a real practical way. It relies on the passing of our faith to the next generation. Obviously, I think God will preserve his church regardless, but I think that is our job. Our job is to pass the torch on to this next generation, to pass the faith on to our children, both our spiritual children, or our physical children and otherwise. And that takes, I think, trust. I think that takes a lot of trust and faithfulness on our part, to trust that when we pass on our traditions and our passions, our doctrine and the church itself to the next generation, that they will steward it faithfully. But at the same time, our job is not merely to survive. I don't think the goal of Christianity is more Christianity. The goal of Christianity is the kingdom of heaven on earth. So our job is to trust that mission, the mission of the kingdom, is far bigger than any one of us alone, that when we pass on the torch, that God is continuing to be doing his work through the next generation. And Elijah didn't just continue the work that Elijah did, but inherited a double portion of his spirit. And Elijah didn't just pass the torch along, but in fact passed on more than he himself even had. And I think that's the hope. That when we pass our faith on to the next generation, that they will actually be more impassioned. They will fulfill the mission even more vigorously than even ourselves. And the other side of that, and I think the thing that I would want to focus on in this moment, is taking up the mantle. I think just as much as the older generation of Christians, literally older or spiritually older, has a job, a responsibility to pass on the torch. I think we as a younger generation have the responsibility to find a mentor, to pursue a mentor. Elijah said, if you do not see me being taken up, you will not inherit this double portion of my spirit. And the result is more than just perpetuating the mission, but in fact, his mission, his passion was doubled. So for us who are immature in faith, for us who are younger, spiritually or physically, we have the responsibility to bridge this gap between the young and the old, to gain a lifetime's worth of wisdom that we could not possibly gain on our own. Particularly before, as the world continues to change, the world that is continuing to pass away, and the knowledge and the wisdom that came with it will be out of our grasp. So we are just as responsible to reach out to the spiritually mature as they are to reach out to us. In fact, if it is true that one of the biggest indicators that your faith will survive the transition into adulthood is the presence of a mature believer, then if you value your faith, I think you have a responsibility to make finding a mentor a priority. I think if you want to have a faith that continues to persist into your adulthood, you have, to find a mentor, find someone, at least someone, to be pouring their faith and their passion for Christ and their mission into you. And I think the picture of the family is perfect, it fits perfectly here. That the single most important factor is a family that practices their faith together and talks about their faith at home regularly. So as parents, our job is to live our faith in front of our children, to talk about our faith, to ask questions, to be participating in faith together at home. And as children, particularly through the middle and high school years, our responsibility is to ask about our faith, to be learning, to be interested in the faith of our parents, and find mentors elsewhere. I think that is that's a powerful message that this story has for us today. So I'll say in conclusion, mentor other people. Pass on your faith. You don't have to do the work of fulfilling the mission on your own. And for us who are younger, we have the responsibility, be mentored. Get to know your spiritual elders. They have wisdom, both spiritual and physical, that you couldn't gain otherwise. If you want a strong faith, you need to get to know the saints. I think we have them in front of us. Take time to get to know them. The mission is to save this world full of people that we love and a creation that is worth loving. You are not alone. You don't have to do that mission alone. Together we can pass on a double portion of our spirit and further the mission until Christ returns as its capstone. Let's pray together, if you would. Worship team, come. Lord God, thank you for the mentors that have brought each and every one of us here. If it is true that they're as important as we think, Lord, they may be one of the biggest reasons that we have made it this far in the first place, that we still continue to practice our faith, that it's still important to us, Lord. Thank you for all of the self-sacrificial work that our mentors have done. Lord, continue to teach us to bridge this gap between the young and the old, to pass our faith on to each other, to make this awkward and uncomfortable transition between the old guard and the new, that we might pass on a double portion of ourselves to the next generation, that we might truly see more and more of your kingdom brought into the world as we pass on the torch. And I pray, Lord, that you continue to encourage our young people spiritually immature and physically immature, to pursue mentors, to get involved in relationships with your saints, Lord, that we might grow to be even more impassioned, even more empowered to do the work of your ministry. Lord, I thank you.